Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you on this unique journey exploring the global aesthetics of the Catholic imagination. My name is Mark Bosco, the Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Georgetown University and a professor in the English department. I think I've had the pleasure to meet you either in person, via Zoom, or at least by email over the last few months. I've also had the pleasure of diving into your work, excited about reading all of you, your work, authors, poets, playwrights from around the world, and to read you as a community through a special lens, a global community, knowing that you are all share in some way a Catholic faith or culture that has shaped you, has shaped and engaged your imagination. Many years ago, Antonio Spadaro and I were having dinner here in Rome, talking about our love for, of course, Flannery O'Connor was first, the intersection of faith and art and spirituality, and the recent success of a Catholic literary imagination conference in the United States. I had just come from the third of these conferences at Loyola University, Chicago, which had been built upon the success of one at the University of Southern California and Fordham University. And as we were sitting there, I said something like, wouldn't it be nice to bring artists and writers from around the world one day to Rome? And we mused about that. Well, no more musing. The day has arrived. And we begin this investigation of the global reach of the Catholic imagination. And we began inviting folks, and neither of us expected how the Holy Spirit was going to interject herself into the planning. As we settled on a date for the conference, we decided to see if Pope Francis would be interested in meeting with us, a man who was a Jesuit, taught literature in Argentina. And he said he'd be delighted to meet us and urge us on with his own thoughts about the importance to the church and the world, this idea. So Rome was not only to be a place to convene a conference, but it has become one that will be in dialogue with the church in a profound way. Indeed, we are to be honored this evening by having His Eminence Cardinal Jose Tolentino, the prefect of the Vatican Dicastery for Culture and Education, to join us, not only to welcome us, but to share his own love of poetry. His Eminence, originally from Portugal, is a poet of great renown and is excited about this convening and the possibilities it presents for the future. And of course, the Holy Spirit had one more surprise up her sleeve when Father Antonio mentioned the conference to Martin Scorsese. He asked if he might join us at the papal audience and for an afternoon interview on Saturday. So there is something really special going on these next few days, something filled with mysterious grace, expectation, and I'm really filled with gratitude that you all said yes to be here. Thank you. I want to thank some others too. Of course, Father Antonio Spadaro and Civita Cattolica, who are hosting us here at this beautiful Villa Malta. I want to thank my colleagues at Georgetown University for their support, and for the many Georgetown alumni, in fact, who helped fund this gathering. So we want to thank our Georgetown alumni for making this happen. I want to thank my friends and colleagues, Dr. Angela Alimo O'Donnell. I just saw her. There she is, from the Fordham's Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, and of course, Dr. Michael Murphy, a dear friend at the Hank Center for the Intellectual Heritage in Chicago. Their collaboration, their counsel, their sponsorship, the conversations we've had over the years were key to making this happen. My interest as a scholar, teacher, and indeed really as a priest has always been in the ways that religious faith produces culture, this intersection between faith and art. I'm especially interested in the Catholic thing, this faith tradition that created great cathedrals, great composers, great painters and sculptors, the great poets that have lived and breathed this faith. But like all of us here, we've grown up in a faith engaged with today's world. Whether you want to call this world modernist, postmodernist, post-postmodernist, Catholicism is lived in today's world in many different geographies, shaped by different histories and cultures, experienced in and through its own struggles to be evangelical in the best sense of that word, to share good news about the story of Jesus Christ, the dramatic unfolding of the incarnation and the redemption, all that remind us that we are beautifully and wonderfully made. And the salvation comes to us when we pattern our love for one another in this Christ. That somehow this way of proceeding produces insight and clarity, authenticity, and adequately represents our human destiny. My favorite Jesuit philosopher, theologian, is William Lynch, and in his magisterial work, Christ and Apollo, he notes that the number one premise of a Catholic aesthetic is a drama of movement. God moving down into humanity as a way back to God the Father. He proposes that, quote, Jesus Christ moved down into all the realities of humanity in order to return to his Father, to get to his Father. I think he's saying that it is the discovery of the depths and richness of human life that was the pathway back to his Father. And this means that life and death of Christ makes some sense of the complexities of our life too, some sense of the tragedies and suffering that we encounter today, and it offers us a direction to how we see salvation at work, how we sense love, justice, and reconciled life at play in the world. This pattern, this way of seeing and feeling and judging, is what I mean by a Catholic imagination. The phrase was coined over 20 years ago as a distinct descriptor of life by the sociologist and novelist, actually, Andrew Greeley. Taking the work of people like William Lynch and the theologian David Tracy, he tried to bring statistical data to ground the truth of this claim for a Catholic imagination. Granted, there has been a Catholic imagination at work in artists throughout the last 2 millennia, but it was only in the last centuries that it has been discussed in academic and cultural circles. I want to read you an extensive quote from Greeley in his first chapter about the development of Christianity within other cultures and religions, and why I think it's important as we begin our time together. So this is Andrew Greeley. The Catholic religious sensibility is often almost overwhelmed by the thickness of the metaphors in its dense forest of imagery and story. God and grace lurk everywhere. But where did this forest come from? Of all the world religions which emerged in the last half of the millennium before the Common Era and first half of the next millennium, Catholicism is the most at ease with creation. It has never been afraid, at least not in principle, of contaminating the purity of spirit with sensible and often sensual imagery. On the face of it, this compromise with nature religion is strange. All the other world religions and quasi-religions like Platonism have abhorred the practice and images of nature religion as defilement of the spirit. Catholicism, in its better moments, feels instinctively that nature does not defile spirit, but reveals it. Hence, Catholicism, again in its better moments, has not hesitated to make its own the practices, customs, and devotions of nature religions wherever it has encountered them. Perhaps the compromise with nature religion in which Catholicism engaged throughout its growth was for reasons of both theory and practical necessity. Yet there is nothing in this theological vision that reveals any hint that baptizing the metaphors of paganism was merely a pragmatic decision. Grace was everywhere even then. This rainforest of metaphors, which Catholicism not only made its peace with, but also patently celebrated, provided it with an enormous wealth of resources. Unquote. Now, Greeley's work is confined to an Anglo-American world highly influenced by his Irish background in a predominantly Protestant United States. But he sees the Catholic imagination offering a different texture, a different dramatic arc, and even transgressive otherness to the prevailing Protestant assumptions of his country. This otherness is what we hope to draw out in the many artists here, from the many locations, cultures, and contexts in which this pedagogy of faith has influenced them. Has this sensibility shaped us today? I want to suggest that there is a sort of transnational movement, at least in the 19th and 20th century, as artists came to grips with the age of enlightenment, which didn't seem to enlighten them enough, apparently, because in their deepest and most adequate desires, it was not enough. So they turned to literature. And we see this otherness in the grandfather of the modern novel, Dostoevsky, whose characters have spiritual struggles just as they have practical struggles with all the reality in which they live. His characters, they are a mystery, a conundrum to themselves. And it is mysterious grace that enlightens that struggle. That otherness migrates to the French in the late 19th century with Léon Blois and the poet Charles Péguy, and continues on in Paul Claudel, Georges Bernanos, and François Mauriac in the 20th century. These artists made Catholic literature and drama into an accomplished literary form that defended the spiritual reality of human life, critiqued the bourgeois manners of both their culture and really of their faith as well, and placed, quote, the sinner at the heart of Christianity. This French Catholic literary DNA then seems to migrate to the British Isles in the early 20th century, a force to be reckoned with in the likes of Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene and Muriel Spark. It then crosses the ocean a few decades later to find itself at work in the likes of Shisako Endo in Japan, Flannery O'Connor in the United States. These artists, all influenced by modernity and its theories and literary forms, engage a Catholic imagination in a transnational, global way, picking up things on its way as it develops and grows. What does this global aesthetic have in common? For these artists of the past, and our query, I think, at this conference is to see if this is in fact true of contemporary artists and faith, is that Catholicism offered them both a critique of modernity and also a powerful philosophical and artistic alternative to it. As the critic Ellis Hansen suggests in writing about the Catholic turn of all these French and British artists at the end of the 19th century, he says there's an alternative Catholic vision of the world that seems to be more creative, an artistic matrix that allowed the rational and the irrational, the spiritual and the material, to coincide. The aesthetic and historical heritage of Catholicism, its theology, its cathedrals, its communion of saints, its rituals and sacraments, its music, its art, spoke more powerfully of the full range of human experience. Hansen provocatively remarks, Catholicism, quote, is itself an elaborate paradox. The church is at once modern and yet medieval, ascetic and yet sumptuous, spiritual and yet sensual, chaste and yet erotic, homophobic and yet homoerotic, suspicious of aestheticism and yet itself an elaborate work of art. Hansen proposes that it is these lived paradoxes that makes Catholic faith and culture such a powerful alternative to the rationalized bourgeois state of life. So to be a Catholic artist, to be a Catholic with a vision of life like this, is to make one's life an artistic adventure, to understand one's life as a work of art. Catholic faith was one of many cultural containers and conceptual signifiers for these paradoxes. Ironically, I think Catholicism, for these artists, and I again wonder for ourselves today, it was not so much a reaction against the world or against the modern, but a new way to be modern, a new way to be in the world. And so we gather these next days to explore this in a contemporary global way, here in Rome, the eternal city that sustains the pluralistic and diverse expressions of this faith and culture. Here we will celebrate the Catholic universal by exploring the concrete particularities that poetry, stories, and drama provide. We gather to celebrate the spiritual underpinning of art and the artistic expressions of the Spirit. We gather to offer a larger platform for all our artists and their work, but also a larger platform to think about, support, and engage a larger, more inclusive vision of the Catholic imagination. We don't obviously represent the entire world of artists, mind you, as this conference and its invitations really grew organically from the writers and thinkers we knew personally to the suggestions that many of you gave us to invite. So it was really wonderful. I would call someone up or I'd text or email and say, well, you should really invite so-and-so. And this is really how this has come to be, a community of people saying, I'd like to be at a conference with them. So this is a beginning, and a rich and diverse beginning at that. I really want to thank you for being here to explore all this with us. And now I want to invite Mike Murphy and Chayuma Elliott to break open the conversation even further. Their biographies can be found on the conference website. And so without further ado, let us hear about the technology of the Incarnation as source and resource of the Catholic imagination. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to jump right into those particularities. Some of the poems I most love to teach come from Tracy K. Smith's 2011 book, Life on Mars, which begins with these words, quote, "Is God being or pure force, the wind or what commands it?" End quote. Part of what makes this group of poems so compelling is the way they try to reconcile seemingly irreconcilable or incommensurate ways of answering questions and solving problems. There's the world of science and the world of humanities. And the speaker has to connect those seemingly incompatible things because she's wrestling with the death of her father, Floyd Smith, one of the only black scientists to work on the Hubble Space Telescope. On the cover of the book is an image of the cosmos taken by that great scientific instrument. This is a book about an adult daughter's grief, a book where questions about the nature and meaning of human life jostle against the scientific, where faith and doubt and wonder jostle against the desire for evidence, order, and objective rather than subjective verification of facts and theories. When I taught this book recently, 2 siblings, twins, came up after class to thank me for putting it on the syllabus. The young woman said, "Our mom died of COVID. Emily Dickinson gets death. She is the only writer who didn't make me angry. Then we read Natasha Trethewey and now Tracy K. Smith. I feel so lucky that there are 3 authors I can read now." "Yes, thank you," her brother said quietly. So what does all this have to do with incarnational technology? The Encyclopedia Britannica says that technology is the application of scientific knowledge to the practical aims of human life. Tracy K. Smith applied scientific knowledge to a very practical human aim, grieving, mourning. That is, figuring out what death is and what it means. Incarnation is the mystery and dogma of the Word made flesh. Put incarnation and technology together, and you have the same productive jostling of the humanistic and the scientific. To me, the incarnation is a technology of transformation. It's about moving from one state to another, motivated by concern for the well-being of others. I think it has implications for how we navigate the smaller transformations in our own lives. The incarnation is also a technology of bravery, because it tells us that the rules are different for the faithful. For example, we might still fear death despite being told not to, but our relationship to it is fundamentally altered by the incarnation, and we can have mercy on our fear and our doubt because of what we know from Christ about flesh and its limitations. We artists are persuaded of the truth of the incarnation in different ways. For the Harlem Renaissance poet and novelist Claude McKay, whose work I teach and write about, persuasion took a long time. It involved seeing firsthand the care of the Catholic worker community. It took being cared for by the faithful when he was old and sick and poor and vulnerable. It took being loved when he couldn't mostly write any more poems or novels. He was embraced exactly as he was, and he wasn't expected to be different. And that, along with a lifetime of observation, led him to convert to Catholicism. In other words, to believe in God's merciful transformation into a human body and to transform himself as a result of that belief. This, for me, is a year of joy, but also a year of grief, because my unborn niece died this winter and my sister Sarah nearly died along with her. So when I think about incarnational technology, I think about that first instance of Christ's incarnation, that in utero time, when Mary was brave and agreed to be Jesus' human mom, and when Joseph was brave and agreed to protect Mary from the disgrace of being an unwed mother, and then later when Joseph took on being a father with all of its implications. All of this before meeting the baby face to face. Bravery. I don't know what Sarah and Joe had decided to name their daughter, or if they'd even settled on a name. To take the pressure off that name reveal, I nicknamed my niece Augie, because when Sarah was little, olive was the most beautiful word to her, and that was how she pronounced it, Augie. When my sister Lila was little, her most beautiful name was Fluffy Plum Balloon, and she bestowed it on a teddy bear. Augie was a big, healthy baby. She was 21 weeks and 3 to 6 days when she died. She weighed a little over a pound. She was too little for the doctors to save, but barely. I've miscarried 2 babies. There are few limits to what I would give if I could have saved Sarah and Joe from this kind of suffering. In the aftermath of my second miscarriage, I was thinking about the incarnation and what it means in the world. My second book of poems is called Vigil, and its central question is, what if we loved God as much as we love the dearest of his creatures? I'm going to read a short poem from Vigil that's called The Watercourse. We walk the banks of the stream, filling your pockets with flotsam, cracked lighter, jointed figurine, bag after sodden bag. To the clatter of flattened cans, the sun slants, deer peer through the bracken, and the heart longs for the beginning. Dirty sandals in your many-roomed house, sand scuffing the floorboards, no history. In the beginning, the body swells. Then she slides out in fat clots and ribbons, and ahimsa, you say. Name her Elizabeth. For 3 days, I refuse to speak. On the 3rd day, you say, blessed are they who mourn, and I walk out of the house, sit under a tree, let its petals clutter my hair. The miracle is how one day divides into many. I bleed and dream, a small bird bobbing in a pot of boiling water, my hands red, and in them her body, yellow and felted, and the house smells pleasantly of chicken, and I blame you. We walk the banks of the stream, filling your pockets, and the heart again longs to see it. The mother pulling the child from the swift green current, his head breaking the surface. To hear it, deep slurp of breath, then his screams, bouncing off the banks, ahimsa, echoing over the water. I think incarnation is a technology that makes and focuses our questions. There's a hip-hop track with a preamble I really like. It announces, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Amen. So many things happen because a soul takes on a human body, even if only for a very little while. My godson tells me that Augie means the king's leg in Benin language. The Bible tells us that God knits us together in the womb and knows us before we are known to our human parents, our human families. I don't know how to knit, but the card table in my living room is still covered with thread and cotton batting and tailor's chalk and fabric and a folder of Etsy patterns for baby clothes and stuffed animals and fabric blocks. I'm not ready to put any of it away yet. Augie was a jumper and a dreamer. She was a really active baby. I am held together by the fact that my sister survived. I'm held together also by anger that the OBGYN's office in my sister's small rural community was closing, so no one returned her calls for days about the referral to a specialist, a referral made by the departing doctor that never got sent to the right place. Anger that she and Joe had to drive for over an hour to get to the closest hospital when Sarah started bleeding, a hospital that told them to drive to another hospital more than 2 hours further on because they weren't equipped to handle this kind of birth and getting an ambulance would take too long. After 2 days in one of the best hospitals in the world, after all their attempts to fight off the infection and delay delivery had failed, the kind doctors at UCSF gave Sarah 2 options. Go home and let the miscarriage progress for the next week and risk hemorrhaging far from a hospital, or euthanize your baby and deliver her stillborn. Say you are faced with the suffering of an innocent, someone who has never sinned and has no personal need of suffering's redemptive power, someone who can feel pain but is too little to understand or make meaning of it by offering it up. Do you risk your own chance at heaven to spare that person pain? I am angry that there is no standard palliative care for unborn children when their parents leave the hospital. It makes that choice even harder. And all of this reminds me of what Mother Teresa once said about visiting the United States, that we had so much wealth and so much spiritual poverty. She saw that poverty especially in our lack of care for the unborn. Donne's grieving speaker in a nocturne upon St. Lucy's Day says to happy people, quote, "Study me then," end quote. He invites the untroubled to learn from the 2 chaoses love made in his life. I'm going to read a poem that responds to a different John Donne poem. It's called I Like an Usurped Town. With the clutter of rooftops, the clatter of streets, the sieve-like patience with which the light wanders over it all, batter my heart. Clutter it with shells and tear sheets, dredge it in flour. Wander it into the clumps of pine needles caught on rooftops, gouge from it half-moons. Thread it onto copper wire, press it flat. Welt and placate and seam and demand goodbyes, stiff brown leaves scraping autumn pavement. Relinquish my heart into a ruckus of paper boats, into a nosegay of yellow lizards, a conclave of flags. Tie it to the masts. Blister until its night smudge tallows every corner. My heart, wind it in clover. Make of it a frontispiece. Render, sunder. The last poem I'll read is a poem I wrote right after Augie died. It's called In the Year of the Green Comet. The sunstones all turned green and basked. They splooted almost. Like squirrels, they gathered heat. The comet, in passing, made a few pointed remarks. It is, you see, on a very long circuit, and we barely even count as spectators. Our lifespans are so short. In a different valley, on a different long-living planet, a song might go, "Blessed be the short lives, blessed be a few footsteps on the ground, blessed be the imprint that doesn't last, blessed be the wind that blows the traces away." For a time, my sister was surrounded by big machines that stopped the bleeding but couldn't save my niece. Machines, I owe you, and I resent your shortcomings. If I were in charge, I would say that the baby took off with the comet, that the baby is sledding off into the snow, Iditarod, laughing, with May pulling crazily full tilt, that the birds are bards now, and the branches ring with comet and girl-child, baby and dog and winter, that her name is a bell among branches, that every snowflake is her handiwork, that the rain in her wake is lace. I'm not obligated to tell you any of this, but listen, I was her auntie. I was the most happy. The big machines failed, and the small ones are dimwits. They get the story all wrong. The red stones turned green and gathered up the heat. They are melting the last vestiges of snow. The baby is sledding off into winter like the comet. We are cuddled together on this couch. We are safe in this firelight, and the windows are holding out most of the cold. Being an auntie to this baby felt bigger than joy. If I'm honest, I think it was grace. My sister reminds me that she and Joe were the lucky ones. They had a truck, a reliable truck, and money for gas. Joe's bosses were kind when he left work in a panic that Saturday and then missed 3 days that next week taking care of Sarah. They had parents nearby to care for the animals in their absence, to feed the dog and the cat and the chickens. And at the end, they had kind nurses and skilled doctors, and they had each other. Blessed are they who mourn. Incarnation, the act of coming into a body, transformation. When the snow melted and the rain finally stopped, Sarah and Joe planted daffodils to celebrate Augie's life. Last week, some of those bulbs started blooming. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Father Bosco. Dr. Elliott, thank you very much. I appreciate the shape and substance of your both of your remarks, and I hope I can add the right kind of music as a response. I'd also like to add my personal welcome as a conference co-sponsor. The Hank Center is most delighted to support this meeting, and we thank Father Bosco and Father Spadaro and Father Simmons, Angela Lima O'Donnell, Angela, thanks, and the great, amazing John Crowley Buck, and all who had a hand in imagining this experience and setting the stage for it. No small task, and rarely have I been more excited to attend a conference. When Father Bosco suggested that we call this session Catholic Aesthetics, the Technology of the Incarnation, my interest was certainly piqued. My mind went right to the dynamic of principles, of course, that of techne and poiesis, two old-time Greek concepts that, because they are ever relevant and alive, or as St. Augustine might say, ever ancient and ever new, still draw attention and insight, especially for artists. Still, I confess I had immediate misgivings, mainly because of my reflexive associations these days with the word technology are largely negative. These associations, all too Catholic, I confess, in both a tired, anti-progressive way, but in a way that really has good reason, too. They're fixed on newer hobgoblins, the hobgoblins of late modern neoliberalism, screen-saturated cultures and technologized states of life that tend to steal our time, stupefy contemplation, and in many ways challenge the natural flows of friendship and community. I think of the French poet Charles Péguy here, a sui generis crossover character who continues to be of major importance, not least because of his enduring contributions to both poetics and public theology. Péguy decried both the modern tendency to substitute faith in technique for the cultivation of wisdom, and he decried the belief that a perfect administration of life could somehow relieve the burden, or rather the adventure, unpredictable as it is, and the delight of living. He decried that kind of administration that we do, that kind of utopian, this Whiggish utopianism or something like that. Sure, it may be that I've been reading too much Péguy lately, and this happens now and again, I confess, but his misgivings still sound credible to me, and I think that they transgress the zeitgeist of any historical moment, and so they touch something larger in any age. The second association I have is that of the technocratic paradigm, and it's largely a product of the first. It is the late administration of life aspect, and has become a deeply entrenched system of power and culture with deep roots both in the industrial and, closer to our moment, the digital revolution. Pope Francis famously and roundly critiques the technocratic paradigm in his game-changing encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si. He follows there the great 20th century ressourcement theologian and first-generation technocritic, Romano Guardini. And Pope Francis observes troubling trends in the letter, and most poignantly here's an example. He writes, "Technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic, and that, in the most radical sense of the term, power is its motive, a lordship over all." Now, that's more Guardini, and the Pope stays with Guardini a bit here, but then he adds something new, Pope Francis does, and this insight is simple but penetrating. A wheel or drill press might be neutral as a technological tool, but the Pope says that digital products are decidedly not neutral. quote, "For they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups." This insight, in its own oblique way, explicitly informs the notion of a technology of incarnation, the misreading of which becomes an exemplary error in Christian thought and praxis, again, in any era. So in short, there has always been something implicitly incarnational in human making. After all, as Tolkien, following Thomas Aquinas, illuminates in distinct ways, we have been given the gifts of being sub-creators. Still, as Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher, famously noted in his tracking of the explosion of mass media culture in the late 1960s, McLuhan wrote, actually it was John Culkin, there's a dialogue, but McLuhan is credited with this: "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." That's an insight that presages the corpse-cold feeling that many of us feel in the face of our hyper-technologized historical moment. In any case, I'm not telling you anything you don't know or that the Holy Father doesn't know or feel deeply in your bones. But let's stay on point and let the technocratic paradigm beat us with its own stick. A shorthand of the Holy Father's misgivings about it might be Twitterized, memified, or TikToked thus: "Humans doing the hard jobs on minimum wage while the robots write poetry and paint is not the future I wanted." That's what was said by Carl Sharo, an architect and a Twitter impresario, last week. But maybe this is not quite the right thing to say here to a room full of writers, so just chill. Yes, it often seems pretty bleak, and the specter of AI, looms large these days with gravity. And all the more reason for us to explore how technology has arrived at such a state, not to mention the ways technology might be recuperated precisely in the incarnational ways in which techne and poiesis always compel us, so as to understand the gift of human making as an implicitly incarnational, sacramental act. In what remains of my time, and just after a little bit more of my academic wonkitude, I'll be leaning mostly on poetry to elucidate my brief points. But the sum of these points will add up to this: it is not simply that we need poetry and the other arts of the beautiful to help us imagine and behold the mystery of the incarnation, but that the mystery of the incarnation itself is what makes the imaginative arts possible. As Tolkien observes in his classic On Fairy Tales from 1947, we make still by the law in which we are made. And the so-called sub-creative act in which we make participates ontologically and analogically in the divine act of creation. We can create and, as importantly, draw meaning from what we make precisely because we are made in the imago Dei. We have images to make, all of us, likenesses to inhabit, all of us, life-giving mystery to perceive, behold, and to render. As I mentioned, my first move when I think about technology is I think about techne. When I think about techne, I always think about poiesis and all that, and I think about Plato, and Plato was all about this in his philosophy more than anything. And for him, techne means the production of things, and poiesis means the products. Production and product, that's how they delineated it. But poiesis also means poetry and poem. So, there's that. Closer to our own days and to the possibilities of techne today is the work of philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy. Nancy is not concerned with theological aesthetics in the way that I am precisely, but his insights help us move more closely to what might be meant by a technology of the incarnation. In his essay, The Technique of the Present, which is on Japanese cultural conceptual artist On Kawara, Nancy separates poiesis from techne. Poiesis is the name of the product, and techne is the name of the process or mode. That's pretty traditional. But then he indicates that art is incarnational, but then deconstructs that. So this gets kind of loopy. It becomes deconstructed into a technique of presence, where presence is a, quote, non-living material inscription, not intrinsic to the thing itself. That's very wonky, but you follow that. It's really important. So this interests me specifically in the way that in one fluid motion, Nancy amplifies the phenomenon of presence, right? While at the same time, he lawyers himself out of naming the intrinsic energy that moves it, that otherwise might create and sustain it. This reticence, admirably humble and innovative in a needed way, I'll add, is a critical departure from classic Catholic sacramental aesthetics, a tradition that not only bridges thing and act, but also out the postmodernists. The reconstructive and reconstituting energies of the Paschal mystery, for example, and the fleshy resurrection of the living God always anticipated and forecloses upon the fetishes of non-material postmodern critique. So let's get to the poetry. To follow a genealogy ever ancient and never new, that of St. Bonaventure, creation is a never-ending act comprised of both revelations and concealments, presences and absences, words and silences. This never-ending event of creation, this perpetual act of presencing that undergirds any notion of incarnation, invites us to an authentic encounter, contemplation, and relationship. This may be why Hans Urs von Balthasar, whose work on theological aesthetics is without parallel, places encounter with beauty, that is, in seeing the form of the beautiful with recognition of its transcendent nature, source, before any conversation. Balthasar, it's beauty first before anything about goodness or ethics or truth or logic. It's the apprehension that's being apprehended by the mystery and grace of beauty. So the form, is historical. It's Emmanuel. It's God for us. It's found in a person, Jesus. Balthasar puts it, the flesh of the Word touches our flesh, and in him God becomes our neighbor. In return, the flesh of God demands a self-same particularity in our aesthetic expressions of this mystery, Christ playing in 10,000 places to channel the oft-cited Hopkins line, all of them, all of us, imagining, opening, and ventilating from our particular settings with our own materials, methods, intuitions, imagination, experiences. All present here are writers and makers who are compelled in one way or another by the doctrine of the Incarnation, by the mystery of the Incarnation that fires the arts and the imagination that creates these arts. Charles Péguy again. A word is not the same with one writer as with another. One tears it from her guts, the other pulls it out from his overcoat pocket. Clearly, the enfleshing of God demands a certain kind of attention, especially for artists. The poet Denise Levertov, long before her formal return to faith, is most helpful here, and her 1965 essay, Notes on Organic Form, is required reading for anybody compelled by an incarnational imagination. For Levertov, organic form is a, quote, method of perception, a recognizing what we perceive, and is based on an intuition of an order, a form beyond forms, in which forms partake, and in which man's creative works are analogies, resemblances, natural allegories, unquote. This appreciation is felt by the poet intensely enough to demand of her its equivalence in words. The poet, in other words, and this cannot be overstated, is brought to speech. We think here of inspiration, Levertov hastens to add, and, quote, the poet breathes in and stands open-mouthed in the temple of life, contemplating his experience. There come to him the first words of the poem, the words which are to be his way into the poem, if there is to be a poem at all. If Levertov the critic knew what she was about, and she did, Levertov the poet turns the volume up to 11. She is both mouth and trousers, as we behold here. The final stanza from her 1982 poem, The Mass for the Day of St. Thomas Didymus. But when my hand, led by his hand's firm clasp, entered the unhealed wound, my fingers encountering rib bone and pulsing heat, what I felt was not scalding pain, shame for my obstinate need, but light streaming into me, over me, filling the room as I had lived till then in a cold cave. And now coming forth for the first time, the knot that bound me unraveling, I witnessed all things quickened to color, to form. My question not answered, but given, its part in a vast unfolding design lit by a risen sun. A question not answered, but given to the doubting Thomas, our spiritual twin. An insight given to the poet Levertov, herself brought to speech in the ways she describes in Notes on Organic Form, in a poetry that unties the knots. The givenness of a poem is precisely the impetus of any technology of incarnation, especially as a category of aesthetics. The poet receives, but receives as a craftsperson, a unique craftsperson, unrepeatable, irreducible. The call of poetry is not merely some Kerouacian stream of consciousness conflagration, which is fun in its own way, but spirit meeting craft. The spirit has its work, you have your work, I have mine, and ours is a joint adventure in the mystery of paying attention. Still, it's one thing to read about how a poem might be given, as I did with Levertov way back there in graduate school, but quite another when you hear it from the mouth of a living, breathing poet of some renown. I hope this is not a cardinal sin to comment on the work of a man who's in the room. My apologies, John Dean. I will never forget the conversation I had with John F. Dean some years ago in Chicago when he declared, with the kind of simplicity that truth declares itself, that poems are given to us. In his By the Wind Sailor, Dean, the poet, attunes precisely to this abundance of divine self-communication, to Christ in the wind, and to a pneumatology of listening and discerning that provides poetic ground upon which to stand. This is from John. I watch out now over Lake Michigan. In me there is a willingness to let go, a readiness to open the pulse that will touch on silence beyond silence, where word has taken root, to reach a faith beyond faith, where word, unheard, responds. There was a day above Keem Bay. Can you paint a beach in cobalt blue? For there they were, innumerable, by the wind sailors, flung ashore by the high tide. It was an image of sky, cerulean blue and shivering, a whole testament of ages, of life and blessed passivity. Words of the world's dramas, its epics and illustrated books where we, at our very best, discover ourselves too, mendicants, loving the absence that will come to save us. Faith in this way, like poetry, is a given. It presents itself often in blessed passivity. We pilgrims ride the wind like feathers on the breath of God. We are, quote, driven by gusts, gasp, or long haul toward shore, till at last, shockingly, the whole beach is written over blue, the color of it, earth, sea, fire, and wind, a gift from the one who writes all into being from the flesh of his flesh. Finally, Christian Wyman. This poem, I submit, is a living wall-to-wall expression of the technology of the incarnation, of which we have spoken, the spirit of its givenness, its invitation to stand open-mouthed at the beauty and the pain of the mystery it seeks to illuminate, its innovative use of the poet's tools of syntax and repetition and fecundating diction. All these elements bring us to a living, breathing, non-wonky contemplation of the ways of God in whom we live, move, and have our being. This is Every Riven Thing from 2010. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, seeing his being simply by being the thing it is, stone and tree and sky, man who sings and wonders why God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone, trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see, God goes belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go. A part of what man knows, apart from what man knows, God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made. To conclude, let us have art respond to art. It's always best. And one more from John, his 2018 poem, The Downs, the Cedars. I read it as a response to Chris Wyman in the selfsame incarnational spirit. It is a given thing, uttered for the riven things, you and me, all of us possessed of so many fallibilities, so that we might know the truest of things. And so, at dawn, at noon, at night, we celebrate what the world has gifted us, the sorrows of imperfection, the joys of tenderness, our prayers to the Lord Creator. He is our peace. We are his poem. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. We're kind of staying to a schedule just because we are packed in so many wonderful people here. But I do want to, if there's a question or a comment, we do have a microphone, I think, ready to go. Maybe, yeah, Antonio has that. Maybe, John, do you want to get up there? Everybody wave to John Crowley Buck. He's the person that got you here, got your room. Couldn't do anything without him. So if there is a question or a comment, it's just a profound contemplative echoing through both of you. So thank you so much for that. But that's all I'll say. Anybody want to have a comment or a question?
Well, first I want to thank my wonderful colleagues up there for these beautiful settings, the setting that you've created for us, those of us who are going to come afterwards. I'm Angela O'Donnell, by the way. Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's been a pleasure to be part of this committee planning this marvelous get-together. Yes, so many interesting crossovers, and I had a number of different thoughts. One of them was I loved Michael's connection between techne and poiesis and the ways in which they connect. And just the other day, I was thinking about Dante and the 26th canto of Purgatorio, where one of the poets refers to another poet as Emilio Fabro, in which the word Fabro is more like building a wall, than it is like putting words together. And that's a very incarnational sense of what a poet is. And coming from the Catholic poet of Catholic poets, Dante is resonating in my mind with all of the things that everyone has said today. One of our great critics as well as being one of our great poets. But so much of the William Lynch, the Levertov piece, I was also thinking of the wonderful David Jones, the sculptor who Levertov loved so much, his wonderful essay, Art and Sacrament, which of course channels Maritain and Thomas Aquinas, but in which he basically talks about this incarnational need that human beings have to create art. And it's part of our DNA, it's part of who we are and what we are, and there's no way for us to kind of resist that. We're always making, whether it's making the story of our lives, or whether it's making other things, other objects, other poems in the world. And the last connection I'll say is I was also, as you were speaking, thinking about John Paul II's wonderful letter to artists, written in 1999, which is such a great document in which John Paul talks about the need of the church for artists, The church needs artists, and artists need the church. And whether they recognize it or not, all artists are working towards the numinous, working towards eternity. And whether it's intentional or not, I guess some people are more intentional about it than others. And also concluding that essay or that letter with the recognition that even people who don't think of themselves as making or makers are making the beautiful artifact of their journey of their lives. So thank you for bringing all of that stuff out in my very disorganized mind, and I'm sure that other people have thoughts.
That was really good with jet lag. I really have to, well done, well done. One of the things that I'm really interested too is how do we have that movement from the poetic to the novelistic, how time and temporality changes what you both spoke about when you have a short story or you have a novel, how you have to enter into it differently than hearing a poem, hearing you speak of it was just, it was all there. It was like a painting, whereas it seems to me like a novel is like a film, it takes a little more time. So I don't know, maybe you could speak a little bit about that, just about how you see that was my word, technology of the incarnation is a kind of way that it's a doing, a making of the incarnation in art. But can you answer or respond to that at all?
Sure. One of the things... Oops. Not on. Well, so one of the things that was really live for me writing the poem for my niece in particular was that my husband and I have we've been listening to audiobooks by Ursula Le Guin. We were listening right around that point to Rocannon's World. This is a science fiction novel. And one of the things that's so vivid for me about the work in that series is that as a novelist, I think Le Guin had a kind of anthropological imagination, created these entire worlds and then documented them with the kinds of landmarks, names, patterns, or things that make them both seem strange and utterly familiar because of our own ways of sort of categorizing different cultures. So that was where my heart was when writing the poem for my niece, was thinking about, okay, so what myth can I make? What story can I tell? So in a weird way, I actually think that poem is kind of a weird distillation of the novel, of Rocannon's World's energy or something. It's a strange thing to do, but like I said, I think I really meant what I said about incarnation being a bravery technology. Faith makes us brave. As artists, I think it lets us do crazy things like that, and think that we can make that synergy happen, even if it's just sort of only in our own brains. That that it's that those connections are transparent.
I would add briefly, the time. Thank you, Char. There are two forms of time. The time in the world of poetry.
Yeah, he's on. No, he's on, I think.
Hello, on. America? Radio Luxembourg? Okay, yeah.
Nice. Microphone check.
Radio
1,
Luxembourg,
2.
here we are. Okay. The world of time in poetry could be different than the world of time in novels. And then I think about how people play with time in novels too when you do a kind of downside up narratives. But it is interesting. I think about all the tools of the novelist. How well can you develop a character in a poem? Well, if you read Milton, you can do a pretty good job of it. But in the shorter forms, it seems to like a different objective. But I really can't say more than that. But the impression of me is that time is they're both time I experience, but they're just different registers of it. Something like that.
Very good. So I want to stay a little bit on schedule here. We're just a little bit. There's a place for coffee and stuff. You can go out these doors, and you can go to. Are we on time? Is this right? We're supposed to be at a break. Yeah, okay, good. I'm looking at John Carly Buck again because he knows everything. This door will be opened as well. You can go to get some coffee there. Hopefully, you'll get a chance to know each other. We're going to be on a journey together. We're not doing any breakouts, right? I'm just hoping that we all can have a retreat in some ways, retreating ourselves to this incarnation seen in art. So thank you all. We'll continue on. You'll be getting little notes about where we're going to do this and that from me off and on. But I want to thank again Chai and Mike.